Thanks for tuning in, guys. Today I'm going to be sharing a very unique and interesting trip report with you. What makes this trip report so interesting and unique is the fact that it was written during the trip, or while the author of it was tripping. Now, this is super rare because when people are in the middle of a psychedelic experience, it is super hard to write any notes down. I never did it. I always did video notes because I just found writing was impossible, and I really don't understand how this guy was able to write any notes at all when he talks about the sort of things he's experiencing. But I'm so glad he did, because so often people will have a trip and they will forget half of what they experienced by the next day, and when they finally decide to record it or share their experience, they've forgotten like 90% of what they went through, and only the very significant events of that trip are remembered. Quick disclaimer, just so you know, this video is not made to promote recreational use of any illicit substances. This person's trip is extremely challenging, and it's all because he kind of underestimates the psychedelic itself, the 2C-E, which is what he's taking. Now, I've gone ahead and structured the original trip report in a way that could kind of make it a little bit more digestible. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to read the full unedited trip report. The author of the story ingested 18 milligrams of 2C-E and said that he had a good feeling about this trip as he'd taken this dose before, but he was about to learn the hard way that this is a very unpredictable psychedelic. Within the hour, minor visuals were kicking in, and he said he was noticing colors in his environment he'd never seen before. However, he started experiencing intense traces to the point that seeing at all became quite difficult, and that's when the trip kicked in much harder than he was expecting. He was struggling to take notes as his thoughts were speeding up too fast to write down. The author decided to lie down and listen to music in order to help relax, but it's here he made a critical mistake. He took 2 big hits of MJ to calm down, but MJ itself is a minor psychedelic, and when taken in the middle of a trip, it will enhance the psychedelic properties of your experience. While listening to music, he began noticing synchronicities, which is something apparently 2C-E is very famous for. Synchronicities are those very strange coincidences that you experience in life, like when you watch a string of movies that all seem to share the exact same theme as one another. But these synchronicities were hinting at something much stranger, that everything in his life was leading to this moment where he would finally wake up and realize who he really is. At the same time, he says his logical mind took a life of its own and began to unravel everything that the author believed to be real. It was as if he was zooming out and seeing how his reality was made of different layers. Each layer was a mental framework of a different part of reality that he believed to be real. However, his logical mind told him that these layers were put in place by his brain to make sense of reality, but were in fact not real at all. Not only that, but they acted as barriers that kept him away from realizing a terrifying truth, one that was about to make itself known. One by one, his logical mind deconstructed each layer and showed how it wasn't real. The author says it was like he was having lots of mini ego deaths because he was drifting away from the world he knew. Not only that, but each time a layer was deconstructed, a new neurotic trait or fear would bubble to the surface. And although he didn't strictly say this, it sounded like the type of fear that was bubbling up was getting more and more intense with each layer, as if he was getting closer to the root of all fear. The author was terrified but powerless to stop, as this logical mind undid everything he knew until fundamental layers such as time itself were being undone. The closed-eyed visuals had also been growing in intensity, but when the author tried opening his eyes, these visuals didn't go away. That's when he realized this was because his eyes had already been opened. Struck with panic, he got up and fled the room. He tried making notes to share what had just happened, but that's when he noticed something very strange. The time was 2:50 a.m. when he wrote the first note after coming out of this experience. But when he went to write his next note, he looked at the clock and saw that time had somehow turned back to 2:40 a.m. As if to reinforce what his logical mind was telling him, time was being altered in seemingly impossible ways. And the author sensed it wouldn't be long until time itself came to a stop. But then he had an idea. In his possession was a substance often referred to as a trip killer, a compound capable of severely reducing the intensity of a trip. The only problem was he had to brew this compound to make it work, and while he waited, his logical mind continued to undo time and his identity. Seconds were turning into hours, and although he could still see the outside world, the concept of self and other was being undone. This led to a state of consciousness where he felt he was connected with everything in reality, which he related to being something like God. But even this was just the final layer protecting him from the truth he'd been running from. And while his logic deconstructed the idea of God itself, he sensed what this truth was. It was his real self, absolute nothingness, a state of being with no perception at all, otherwise known as the void. His entire life before this trip felt nothing more than an imagined reality, and he believed that when he entered this void, he'd experience an eternal spiritual death that he'd never come back from. And as sheer panic took over, a very dangerous idea came to his head. The author remembered a large knife in his kitchen and thought that if he could have a physical death, he would be able to save himself from the void and return to the world in the next life. His options were running out, and before he made a decision, he wrote down one final note: drink the brew. Also, side note, he didn't actually use the word brew. He does mention a specific substance, but I think that YouTube might censor the video if I say that word. Time slowed down further and further until it completely stopped, and then a single moment turned into eternity. As he faced the void, he tried to resist it, but he could no longer deny his logical mind. He said he realized that the truth was he didn't exist at all, and what he was becoming was far realer than, in his words, the silly little life that he'd been clinging to. Finally, he gave up, surrendered, and entered the void. But only 20 minutes later, a new note was added. It worked. At some point, he'd managed to drink the Trip Killer brew, and it had finally kicked in, returning him to the world that he knew with no more than minor visuals persisting. Even though he was still tripping, he had no memory of what had occurred after he entered the void, and could say no more than what he'd just experienced was an absolute ego death. But the next day, he did write some notes reflecting on the trip. While he had no persisting effects, he truly believed what he was shown was the ultimate truth. He mentions that what he'd experienced was in fact the classic psychedelic experience of merging with everything. But having graduated with a major in math, he knew that everything was infinite, and infinity and nothing are really two sides of the same coin. And in case you missed it, in an earlier video I made about the different levels of the DMT experience, I mentioned that the ultimate ego death will merge you with everything, but that everything will be exactly the same as becoming nothing. So it definitely seems like even on different psychedelics, people are going to the exact same place, or at least one that's extremely similar. He finished by saying what he'd seen was terrifying, impossible, yet completely logically sound. As I said before, guys, I've shared this so that you can see how these substances are not really made for recreational use. If you take them very lightly, they can kind of humble you, and in a very beyond what you've ever experienced in your sober life sort of way. But there's also extreme potential if there was more research done on these substances, and if this research was shared with the general public so that they knew what to expect more, they could probably kind of prepare to let go of their ego more easily, and perhaps that would induce more beneficial trips. But anyway, guys, if you also want a change on research policies and want to help spread some psychedelic awareness, definitely feel free to subscribe. And beyond that, guys, hope you have an amazing day. If not, make it an amazing day, and I'll see you all soon.